Chapter 8. The two boys put in the following day, going up Poplar Lake, loading up with provisions from the supply left at Lindsay's home camp, and walking back to the foot of Squaw Lake. Jim spent the night there in his brother's shack, then hit the trail for his own camp on Squaw River. His shoulders were sore from the heavy packing. With the dogs he could load a sled and make better time on the trails. For that reason he decided to let the lower trapline go until he had made a trip to Wabing. He set out the morning of the 14th, traveling light. There were 6 inches or so of new snow fallen in the night, and already the white surface was written over with the signature of scores of different animals and birds. The morning was fair, the air cold but dry and bracing. He swung along like a young bull moose, glad to be alive. Halfway up Poplar Lake he had a feeling of being followed. When he glanced back he saw 3 timber wolves trotting along his track 100 yards in the rear. They stopped the instant he turned and stood there watching him with inscrutable eyes. "Gosh," he muttered to himself, "what a sap I was not to bring the rifle. I could drill that front one just as easy." He had left the .32 at home in a deerskin case, thinking he could travel faster if he didn't have it to carry, and here was $40 worth of pelt and bounty begging to be taken. He wondered if the wolves realized that he had no gun. They sure were bold about it, trailing him that way. Slowly he raised his axe and aimed the handle as he would a rifle barrel, but there was no scurrying to cover among the wolves. The only movement he could see was the slow waving of the leader's brush. "Can't fool you, can I?" Jim grinned and plodded ahead up the lake. He didn't bother to look back for another half-mile. When he did, the gray trackers had disappeared. Jim rarely bothered with a noonday meal unless he happened to be in camp. He had eaten a good breakfast that morning, and now he pushed ahead through the brief northern daylight without a pause. On the shore of the little pond to the south of Porcupine he came to a roughly fashioned trap house. At first glance he thought it might have been built by his sisters, for the place had only been 5 or 6 miles from their cabin on Wabing. There was a red fox dead in the trap. Jim went closer, and on the point of taking the animal out, he noticed the bait. It was moose meat, and the trap itself was an old-fashioned double-spring affair, unlike anything of the Vanderbecks' equipment. He remembered then the Hudson Bay Indian, Joe Leek. The Cree must be trapping this ground. A tremendous barking heralded Jim's approach to the home cabin. The dogs had seen him coming across the cove through the naked hardwood of the clearing. Then he caught sight of Ada waving at him from the doorway and quickened his pace to a trot. It was good to strip off his mackinaw and heavy sweater and bask in the warmth of the home-like room. Good, too, to hear the women folk chatter and sit down to a heaping plate of his mother's cooking. Yes, they told him there had been a letter from Toronto, brought through by a meal. Big Lindsay would be coming home soon, in a week perhaps, and had arranged with a man in Nakina to carry him to Waba with a fast team of dogs. After supper, Jim brought in enough wood to last them a day or two, then settled himself to read a magazine, reveling in the luxury of the kerosene lamp. His mother and the girls were sewing and mending around the table. Hardly had they made themselves comfortable when the peace was shattered by a ferocious turmoil rising from the dog huts. "Must be an animal back there," said Jim, getting up. "That or somebody's coming." At that moment there was a rustle of snowshoes outside and a knock on the door. "Come in," called Mrs. Vanderbeck, and as the latch lifted and the heavy door creaked open, Jim saw a squat, small Indian in a greasy canvas coat, a shapeless black felt hat pulled down over his ears. His beady little dark eyes shifted from the women to Jim, and his feet hesitated for a bare fraction for a second, though his seamed face did not change expression. "Come in, Joe Leek, and shut the door," Miss Vanderbeck replied curtly. But with a man in the house, the Indian seemed to feel it improper to return her greeting. He nodded his head solemnly to Jim, then turned and spoke a gruff word in Cree to something behind him. A little Indian boy of 9 or 10 darted across the threshold like a scared rabbit, and Joe Leek closed the door. Jim indicated the end of the puncheon bench. "Sit down," he said. "You got a pipe? Here, smoke." He brought a can of his father's Navy cut from the shelf, and watched the man fill a dirty old briar pipe taken from his pocket. Refusing the match Jim offered, the Indian leaned down to the wood box for a splinter of pine and lit it through the opening of the stove. He drew 4 or 5 slow puffs, savoring the aroma of good tobacco. Then, ceremoniously, he offered the pipe to Jim. The boy suppressed a shudder and took the blackened thing in steady fingers. He managed a couple gentle pulls as a matter of etiquette and handed it back. Now the conversation could proceed. "Boy," said Joe, after a moment of polite silence, "him sick." Jim looked at the ragged urchin in some alarm, but there was no red spots or other signal of contagion on his grimy copper skin. "What's the matter with him?" he asked. The Cree's words of explanation were few, but he made himself entirely plain. Miss Vanderbeck's motherly interest was aroused. She muttered, rising from her chair. "A good dose of castor oil is what he needs." When she was getting the bottle and an old pewter spoon, Joe Leek explained the failure of his own favourite tribal remedy. "Me peel 'em bark jack pine," he said. "Boy lick 'em. Too cold, no sap, no good." "Here, youngster," said Miss Vanderbeck kindly. "Take a spoonful of this." The Indian growled something in Cree and pushed the boy forward. Jim watched him with amusement as the spoon neared his open mouth. His black eyes shone something between fear and excitement. He was having an adventure. The viscous stuff was in his mouth now, and he looked surprised but gulped it down manly and made no outcries or faces. "There," beamed Jim's mother. "I think he'll be all right now." Joe Leek seemed pleased. He jerked a finger at the bottle. "Me get 'em big medicine at store," he said. "What name call 'em?" Jim got a scrap of paper and fished the stub of pencil out of his pocket. "Here," he laughed. "I'll write it down for you. You just ask the man at the store in Nakina for a bottle of that." And he laid the pencil on the bench and handed the prescription to the Indian. Joe Leek folded it with some care and deposited it in his shirt pocket. Only then did his face crack into a smile, and he nodded his thanks to Miss Vanderbeck. Seizing the youngster by the wrist, he was about to depart when Joe stopped him. "Is that your trapline up there on the small lake?" he asked, pointing northward. The Cree gave a grunt of assent. "I came by there today," Jim said. "There's a fox in your trap." "Me go get him tomorrow," the Indian replied briefly and walked out with his son in dignified silence. Jim went back to his magazine with a grin. "Didn't act very grateful about it, did he remarked. "Don't you worry," said his mother. "They don't make a show, but they're grateful enough, poor things. 8 of them in that awful shack and nothing more than to live on but moose meat. No wonder they got off their feed." "Have you been up to see their place?" Jim asked in some surprise. "Sure have. The woman paid us a call a few days after we got here, so we returned it. Never saw such a dirty hole in all my life, but there, the poor soul hasn't anything to do with it. Besides, she comes from way up beyond Fort Churchill somewhere. She's not used to civilized ways." "An Eskimo woman," Ida put in. "I think she's better looking than any squaw I've ever seen. She's tall and straight and not fat, like I thought Eskimos were, and she's got queer eyes sort of slanting. Emil says the track Indians are afraid of her. They think she's a witch." "You ought to see their girl," Mary said, biting off a piece of thread. "The skinniest, forlornest little thing. They make her work all the time, scraping moose hides. How many is it Joe's killed already this fall, Ma? 12 or 13? They only bring $1 apiece, and that poor kid has to spend days on every one of them, scraping away with an old shin bone to get off the hair." "Gosh," Jim frowned. "Killing moose at that rate's pretty bad. They let Indians have a moose a month, but a dozen of them in 5 weeks. Man, that's wicked. I'd complain about it to the game warden, only I know he don't like to meddle into Indian affairs. These treaty Indians are just like children. They're always killing any animal they wanted for food, I guess, and that's fair enough. But the government ought to tell them where to stop when it comes to slaughtering moose that way." His mother patted his shoulder. "You quit worrying about it, son," she said. "Dear knows there's plenty of moose in this country, and I reckon one Indian won't exterminate 'em. We'll see what Dad wants to do about it when he gets here. Now it's bedtime. We've wasted enough kerosene tonight, if you remember what a job it is to pack it in here." "All right," Jim yawned. "Just give me a couple more minutes to write up my diary." He got the little black pencil out of his possible sack and reached in his pocket for the pencil stub. "Now where the dickens did that go?" he inquired, mystified. "Oh, I remember. I left it on the bench here." But a search of the floor failed to reveal it. There was uneven cracks between the puncheons, and Jim finally decided the pencil had slipped through one of them. He got down another out of the cupboard and jotted down the events of the day in his diary. Then his mother pulled the cloth curtain that partitioned off the girls' sleeping quarters, and they all went to bed. Jim had set the alarm clock for 6. It was pitch dark, of course, when the bell woke him, but he could see the stars shining clear above the lake. He built up the fire while his mother was dressing, then put on his outdoor clothes and went to the shed behind the cabin. From the racks overhead he selected a light 7-foot toboggan. Several sets of dog harnesses hung on pegs, freshly oiled and supple. He took down the shortest of them, a 2-dog hitch, and went over each strap and buckle to make sure of its strength. The collars were steel framed, padded with leather. They looked exactly like miniature horse collars, except they were rounder to fit a dog's neck. They even had tiny steel hams on the top where they buckled together. From a ring in either side of the collar, a trace strap led back towards the sled. The second harness in the tandem was fastened to the traces by short straps, so that the lead dog would never be pulling directly on the collar of the one behind him, and the tugs were held up by saddle straps running across each dog's back, behind the shoulders. As soon as breakfast was eaten, Jim went up to the kennels. The whole pack greeted him with eager whines, and he stopped to pat each dog in turn. When he came to Pat and Bruno, he unfastened their chains from the run poles and brought them back to the cabin. Bruno, the big German shepherd dog, had been Jim's leader for 2 years. He was quick, tireless, and intelligent, an ideal animal to lead a team. Pat, heavier and thicker furred, was part Collie and part Airedale, with a trace of St. Bernard to give him size. He lacked Bruno's nervous energy, but made up for it with grit and sturdy power. The girls had loaded the sled with Jim's winter clothing, his pack-sack, an axe, and long winter snowshoes. A carefully wrapped bundle of his mother's biscuits and a dried apple pie completed the cargo, and a tarp was laced over the top. Jim led Bruno to the harness and slipped the collar round his neck. At the familiar feel of it, the big dog shivered a little and looked up at his master and wagged his tail. He knew he was going back to work. Next, Pat was harnessed. He growled once and snapped at the trace strap, then stoically submitted to fate. The young trapper settled his snowshoes, waved a goodbye to the family, and stepped to the front of the team. "Hop, Bruno," he called, and they were off. Until they reached the single track northward from Wabing, Jim led the trail. Then he dropped back to let Bruno follow the broken trail. The light toboggan ran smoothly, and it was easier walking in its wake. They had been moving for less than an hour and had covered perhaps 3 miles when Bruno halted suddenly, growling deep in his throat. Jim yelled at him to go on, but the dog stayed where he was, his nose sniffing at the trail and a sharp ridge of fur rising along his back. The boy ran forward around the sled and reached the leader's side. A single glance showed him what had stopped the dog. There in the snow was a great, deep footprint, clear to the very points of the toenails. The big wolf had passed that way in the night. Jim knelt and laid his open hand in the track. It was the same gigantic paw track that he and Lindsay had seen up on the squaw. As he rose, the old lead dog jerked his grizzled head back and went vent to a weird, mournful howl. "Shut up, you fool," Jim ordered angrily. "Might think you never smelled a wolf track before. Come on now, get moving, the pair of you." He strode ahead, and the dogs obediently came after him. It was only when they passed the frozen body of the fox in the trap a few miles on that Jim thought of Joe Leek and his Eskimo witch wife. The trail of the wolf monster had been heading straight across country towards the Indian's cabin. In spite of himself, the boy had a queer feeling. An hour before sunset that night, they reached Jim's home camp. He had cut the logs for dog kennels before he left, and now he quickly threw up the walls and nailed the pole roof in place and piled snow on top. By dark, the 2 huts were finished. He tossed a heap of spruce tips in the bottom of each and hooked the dog chains to the staples. Pat and Bruno sniffed all around their new quarters, then went inside and lay down. Jim soon had a good fire going in the cabin stove. He put on a couple pails of snow to melt and cooked a mash of cornmeal and fish for the dogs while his own supper was in progress. An hour later he turned in. Tired as he was, his sleep that night was disturbed by an uneasy dream of yellow, slanted-eyed squaw who took on the shape of an enormous wolf. The morning of the 16th dawned clear, and Jim was up betimes. The dogs needed rest after their first day's haul, so he left them at home and spent the days cruising up a nearby brook in search of mink sign. There were few tracks, but it looked like good country, and he set 2 traps before returning to camp. He planned to start next day on the long circuit down the squaw and up the Porcupine. With good luck, he'd be back inside of 5 days.